My name is Bruna Gagliardi. I'm one of the fellows here, the AsiaGlobal Institute. I'm from Brazil, and I'm a diplomat with Brazil's Foreign Service. And it's my honor, my pleasure to be here moderating this panel today, formed by all women. Yes. Exactly. This just shows what the future will look like. Diane Mack is the Director of International Development at Social Finance and currently 2018 AsiaGlobal Fellow with me here at the University of Hong Kong. She focuses on the design of innovative, results-focused funding models that bring in private capital to address social and development challenges. She advises organizations such as the World Bank, the Global Fund, the UK Department for International Development, Clinton Health Access Initiative, and governments around the world to support them in delivering better outcomes. Jeanne is the director of the CLP Research Institute and has been with CLP for almost 15 years, helping to start and head up the Global Environment Affairs and the Group Sustainability Departments. She has extensive experience in the environmental industry and has held senior roles in international environmental and engineering consulting companies prior to joining CLP. Then our third panelist is Noeleen Heyzer. She was the UN Under Secretary General and the first woman to head the Economic and Social Commission for Asia Pacific since its founding in 1947. Under her leadership, the Commission focused on shared prosperity, social equality, and sustainable development. Responding to the global financial crisis of 2008, she developed the Commission as a major platform for the region to rethink new drivers of inclusive growth and sustainable development based on 4 pillars: regional trade and connectivity, closing the infrastructure and development gaps, and developing a new finance architecture and addressing shared vulnerabilities. And finally, Pamela is the Director of Sustainability for the Fung Group and Executive Vice President of Supply Chain Futures with the Fung Academy. She helps the group's factories to use technology to improve their performance and sustainability and to mitigate key environmental and social risks. Pamela will talk about how the Fung Group is using mobile technology, sensors, and blockchain to empower workers and to create a more sustainable manufacturing sector in Asia's emerging markets. So now they are all introduced. I would just like to talk a little bit about the format for the event today. So we have about 20 minutes now for just some initial remarks for all our panelists. And then we'll have 15 minutes of moderated discussions where I'll ask them some questions. And then I'll open up to the public. We'll have about 20 minutes for general questions. So do think of clever and short questions so everyone can participate. And then just some 10 to 15 minutes for closing remarks. So without further ado, I would just like to pass the microphone. Oh, actually, you don't have to pass the microphone. You have your own. Everyone's a microphone. So please, Diane.
Thank you so much, Bruna, for the introduction. And let me say I'm delighted to be joining such a distinguished panel of all women speakers today. As Bruna mentioned, I work in the impact investment field. I've been very much involved in designing impact investment products that align financial and social impact over the past 10 years of my professional career. Before that, I was involved in finance, NGO, and government consultancy. I think for me, impact investment is really one of the many ways to try and help fill the gap that we have in financing for the SDGs, to achieve the SDGs in developing countries. I think you all know that the estimate is that we're facing a shortage of around $3 trillion US. So impact investment in its own way can contribute towards this gap. Just as an example of an impact investment approach that I've been working on quite a lot in recent years. This approach was first developed in the UK. It's called a social impact bond. And essentially what the social impact bond aims to do is to channel private sector investment into funding the provision of programs, product services that improve social well-being. After the investor invests in this bond, essentially what happens is that this money goes to the social purpose organizations who deliver the services, and only if pre-agreed social outcomes are achieved would government or donors actually repay the investor plus potentially a small premium if outperformance is achieved. So in this sense, it's a mechanism really of transferring social innovation risk outside of the public sector, and also to align incentives across different stakeholders in this development enterprise. I'll give a quick example of one of the impact bonds I've recently been involved with, which is around maternal and child health in West Africa. So in this impact bond model, what we did was raise private investment to improve the equipment available in health facilities, and also roll out a train-the-trainer model to health staff in health facilities across West Africa in order to reduce the mortality rates of preterm and low birth weight babies. Before we entered the hospitals, the mortality rates was around 50%, so 1 in 2 preterm low birth weight infants were dying at these hospitals. And what we're aiming to do is really to capacity build hospital staff to improve that delivery. And actually a similar impact bond, also focused on maternal and child health, has already been launched in Rajasthan and India. So, quite a lot of activity going on in Asia at the moment in this field. And in that model, it's really, again, capacity building health staff to reduce the amount of infant mortality when there's complications in delivery and labor. This is one example, and since the launch of the first social impact bond in the world around 8 years ago in the UK, there's now around 120 impact bonds all over the world, mobilizing around $400 million of impact investment. Obviously, this is just a starting point, and hopefully there will be many more. But in this short period of time, we've diversified our focus from maternal and child health to elderly care, to preventing young people from going into the institutional care system, preventing diabetes, and a range of social issue areas which require the reallocation of resources towards preventative services and aligning of outcomes amongst key stakeholders. I think finally what I would say is that social impact bonds is just one of the many different impact investment approaches that are available in the social investment market right now. And what we need is really the development and experimentation to build out a more mature social investment market, so that different types of investors, regardless of their risk-return profile, will be able to participate in contributing to social and environmental outcomes by participating in different types of financial instruments. And it's very exciting to see that actually this is picking up in Hong Kong and China. These 3 months I've been at Hong Kong, there's been numerous conversations around innovative financing approaches. Some of you in the room are also involved in that enterprise, and really excited to see what will happen next. Thank you.
My passion is on climate, and of course I work for an energy company. When we talk about developing in Asia, obviously the one thing you do need is energy. However, the traditional way that we get power is linked to fossil fuels, which is linked to carbon emissions, which is linked to climate change. So we have a bit of a challenge here, especially in this part of the world. We don't have as much of the renewable energy that is naturally occurring, and even the cost of such energy still has yet in this part of the world to become sort of on par with the fossil fuel energy. And in fact, coal is still, in many countries in this part of the world, the cheapest form of energy, especially when you talk about critical mass. And what's interesting is, there is this inequity question. Do you ask those who don't have energy today to wait for zero carbon energy to be affordable for them to have energy? And this is something that I think it is quite a difficult challenge to overcome. But having said that, there's, in terms of all doom and gloom, it's not doom and gloom. Actually, I always say under every cloud there is a silver lining. So I think in Asia there is an opportunity. I think we can, because we're not entrenched in terms of infrastructure, so in some cases we can build from scratch and we can plan and strategize in a better way. How do we plan our cities? How do we plan our development? That in turn can help us determine also, well, can we have more distributed energy systems work in cities, for example, and how would that work? How does a smart city work in sort of in harmony in terms of not just your typical power stations giving energy, but your transport, your buildings? How is that all connected up? And when we all talk about a zero carbon future, what is that really going to look like? So there is opportunity, and I think there's 4 elements to that. First, we do have to recognize the science. The science tells us what the limits of this earth are. We can't question that. It is what it is. We have technologies. Technologies are the tools that can help us achieve zero carbon or reducing carbon. We do need the finance to push the implementation. At the end of the day, someone does have to pay for it. Someone does have to pay for the infrastructure and the technologies. But I think the 4th, which is the most complex today, is the context and the policies. Those are going to be what dictates the rate of change in each of the countries and what can be done, because those also dictate how fast technologies can develop or be deployed in different countries, right? So if you have protectionism happening, maybe there's not as many technologies that can proliferate. And if the other way around, if you can't get the financing to work, that we can't, and there's a lot of money out there. I keep hearing, everybody tells me it's not that there's no money. There is a lot of money, but the money is not going in that direction. And usually the reason why is because in the past, because energy infrastructure is locked in for 40 years, 60 years, and you're talking hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars locked in for a long period of time, it's not a very sexy investment, right? But, all the other sectors, faster returns, a lot of changes in terms of technology and advancement, therefore people want to put their money there because it feels like the returns are coming quicker or faster. So somehow, and I'm not a finance person, I'm looking to my left and right, thinking, if we could find a way to make the finance work, I think that is one critical cornerstone of how we could help to overcome and get more clean energy in Asia.
I look at the title of this session, and it's really about addressing some of the biggest development challenges within Asia. And Asia has a history of actually dealing with large development challenges. And if you look at it, we were the ones who actually reduced our poverty, got 1 billion people out of poverty, have created a huge middle class through education, investment in education, investment in healthcare, in housing, basically developing some of the support structures, if you like, that created that. And also investment in the productive sector of the economy, so that actually the emphasis on employment and the growth was actually a job-led growth based on in improving our productive sector. So that is one set of challenges. But at the same time, whilst we have managed to get so many people out of poverty, grown our middle class, this benefit is not even. We have left many people behind. And in fact, Asia houses the bulk of the world's extreme poor. Almost 70% of the world's extreme poor happens still to be in Asia. And at the same time, almost 70% of underweight children under the age of 5 happen to be in Asia. And 1.74 billion people still have no access to sanitation and to water. So basically, we have not completed our development journey. And whilst we are still trying to finish this development journey, or what is often called the Asian miracle, new challenges have actually emerged. And I would like to address 3 new challenges. What has happened to the impact of globalization on Asia? And one thing which I've seen is the fact that we have grown, but we have grown very unequally. And the concentration of wealth, especially in the hands of the ultra net worth, high net worth individuals, are huge. And if I look at some of the figures, people are saying like, in fact, that this group of people who own about almost $8 trillion worth of wealth actually is about almost 17 times more than all the least developed countries in Asia in terms of their GDP. Their wealth is 17 times more than the GDP of the 13 least developed countries in Asia. So just looking at the individuals and the countries, we're not even talking across communities and so on, right? So basically, the impact of this type of extreme inequalities is bad for growth, is not sustainable, and it damages basically communities, and it builds distrust. So increasingly, this is one big issue that we need to address. How do we make sure that we actually can grow, but grow in a more inclusive way? Now, the problem with how this developed is the fact that for a very long time, people got out of poverty and became middle class through work, through moving up the low quality work to the higher quality work, through the investment in human capital, through education, through skill building, and so on. But increasingly, the wealth that is being formed comes from the financial flows. And it also comes from the concentration of assets, right? And there is a de-link between employment and economic growth. And in fact, the growth of the formal employment is actually decreasing, and formal employment itself is actually becoming casualized, and you have more outsourcing, you have more contract work, and so on. So I think that this makes it difficult for people to actually get out of poverty just through work, or become middle class, or to move up to a higher middle class through employment, unless you are able to occupy a particular highly skilled sector. And I think that this is where there is a concern about what is happening to our children, and why many of our children feel that they will not have the type of lifestyle that many of their parents will actually have. Unlike our generation, in my generation, we all knew that we were going to have a much better future than our parents. So that's one set of questions and challenges. I think the other set is the fact that currently we cannot think of growing first and cleaning up later. No, in the same way as we cannot think of growing first and then sharing later. We're often talking now, today, of shared prosperity. We also have to think of how is it we can grow in such a way that we take into account the boundaries of our ecosystem, of our planetary systems. And this is really making sure how do we not just industrialize, but how do we urbanize? In fact, even in China alone, there will be a growth of about 13 new megacities. And these cities, each mega city is having a population of about 10 million people. So how do we design our cities so that it's more sustainable in terms of our transport system, our buildings, the way we basically deal with our natural resources, our water, our air, what type of industrialization are we developing so that we don't pollute our air. In fact, some of the data that we have, people, about almost 1 million plus people, 1.4 million I think, die every year because of air pollution. And really, this has become a problem. So the impact of polluted air on our health systems is a major concern. So basically, the way we do our urbanization, the way we deal with industrialization is a concern. But at the same time, there are shared kind of vulnerabilities. The impact of climate change on weather patterns, on our food systems, on natural disasters. Asia is the most exposed continent when it comes to natural disasters. And therefore, we should actually be the lead in terms of really looking at how we deal with having a more sustainable agenda in terms of our growth. So some of the ways forward, right? And I think the third challenge I would talk about is the kind of technological disruption that I know that you'll be talking about, Pamela. So I won't touch too much on that. But let me just talk about some of the issues of inclusive growth very quickly, and also of the green economy. Maybe I start mainly with the green economy. I think that even if we look at the energy system, which you talk about, I think it is possible to make sure that we have universal access to modern energy. Because currently, about 1 billion people have no access, especially in the rural area, to modern energy systems. So how do we close that gap? Secondly, how do we actually increase energy efficiency? How do we double up on energy efficiency? And the third one is, how do we ensure that there is an increased share of sustainable clean energy, up to almost 30% in our energy mix? And how do we actually develop our energy grid in such a way that we can be sharing much of this type of energy in the same way as we design our cities, our transport system. And I also saw that if the future of job can be green, we can actually develop a circular economy where it will actually generate 6 million new jobs through reusing, remanufacturing waste materials. So I think there is a whole new way of doing work. In terms of the inclusive economies, I think it's time, since we are all a women's panel, to get women out of the lowest echelon of the manufacturing scale, and really train women to take advantage of the new technologies that are coming up. There is no reason why women cannot play a lead in the new technologies and benefit actually from that. Because currently, you find that women are in the low-quality jobs, in the more labor-intensive jobs, and that is a concentration, but that is not the future. It is the past. And therefore, the whole emphasis on training, human capacity building, but making sure that from the very young age, girls and boys are not segregated like us here, where we are all women, and then talking about the biggest development challenge, and the men are talking about the trading system. I think... I think we want a conversation of both men and women about how to address our biggest development challenge. Thank you.
Basically, for those of you who don't know what Lee and Fung does, we work with around 10,000 factories to source garments and consumer products for retailers and brands worldwide. So, I mean, my experience basically comes from basically engaging factories and upgrading them to be sustainable, more efficient, faster, more flexible, transparent, and so on. And we use new technology as as one of the tools, as actually the major tool. We do a lot of human capacity building in terms of teaching management and business planning and so on, but a lot of our work recently is actually technology-based because the price of technology has actually fallen very rapidly simply because of the acceleration in the rate of computing power. So now access to the cloud is actually cheap, storage is actually cheap, different technologies are getting very accessible. And so basically over the past couple years, I've really come to see how technology can be a solution to development issues. And for me, the big development issue that we need to address is that it's the very ironic state that as Asia has created lots of jobs and lifted a billion people out of poverty and really helped to power the global economy and is like the new frontier of global opportunity now that everyone wants to invest in Asia because growth in the US and Europe is sort of stagnating. At the same time as we've had so much miracle, actually inequality has really widened. So, I mean, and this is, it's a result of governance, it's a result of fast development and so on. I'll just give you a couple statistics. In Vietnam, in 1993, 58% of the people were in poverty, so living below $2 US a day. And in 2015, only 5%, which is huge progress. But at the same time, actually, Vietnam's Gini coefficient actually got wider. And today, the richest man in Vietnam makes in one day what the poorest man will require a decade to make. Okay, so that's very, very extreme, and that's from an Oxfam report on poverty that was issued earlier this year with the World Economic Forum. So I encourage you all to read that. It is really sobering. So, and today, even more ironic is that Vietnam is being feted as the most ideal location for companies to outsource production from China. In fact, we have, our own factories in Vietnam, they face intense competition for workers because everyone, autos, consumer electronics, accessories, bags, all kind of consumer and industrial goods, they all want to produce in Vietnam. And last year, the GE head of Southeast Asia, he said actually GE's most efficient plant in Asia is actually in Vietnam. So our workers in garment factories, which are like hot, sweaty, labor-intensive, they're all being poached away to go work in air-conditioned factories that are making consumer products. So anyways, Vietnam is now a great location for international investment, also because now there's a tariff situation, and also because Vietnam did a lot of work to prepare for TPP, which of course never happened. But anyways, the strategic investments that they made in extended supply chains are now really paying off. But at the same time, we've got this big wealth inequality. So, I think we have to be very realistic on how to use technology to address these kinds of problems. And so I'm just going to suggest a couple ways. One, so if you're a worker in a factory, your greatest lack is probably something like goes in the range of one, you don't make enough money because you're making a minimum wage, and even if you do overtime, you probably really don't make enough to have a really good life yet, okay? Two, education, in that your education that you receive in public school in Asia really doesn't prepare you for relevant jobs, especially those jobs which are being created in the digital economy. Number three, you actually are open to a lot of abuse because you can't get information about what your rights are. You don't have information about who governs you and how you might change some of the localized conditions. And it's very difficult to connect with those in similar situations. And then lastly is the lack of access to finance. So if you actually want to invest in anything, or even just borrow money to buy an apartment or a house, then you don't know where to go. And so you're actually subject to like money lenders who are charging 20% or 25% interest, and sometimes that may be per quarter. So poor people are open to a lot of abuse, even those who have formal jobs. And in our factories, actually, everybody makes the minimum wage, but even they, their family, their friends, and so on. So they actually are in the range of a lot of abuse going on. So how can technology help? So just going down those, and this is what we've learned from launching our own workers app. So we actually launched a mobile app for factory workers with the express purpose of, one, educating and engaging them from the point of view of the factory management. So we put a lot of content on the factory workers app related to health, so health and safety, personal development like financial literacy, what is a bank, what is an investment, how do you borrow money, why should you not borrow money from a moneylender, all these kind of things. Nutrition, diet, health, because if you don't have health, you don't have much. And then increasingly personal development. How do you find resources on the internet to advance your own career? And this is something that, so we think actually the smartphone and smartphone penetration is actually increasing very, very rapidly, so that by like 2020, all factory workers are basically going to have a smartphone. So how do we use this as a tool to educate and empower workers? And at the same time, to teach factory management that they can actually use a smartphone to engage their workers. And today, if you go into any factories, except for those run by one single company, actually smartphone is banned. You are not, if you're working on the floor, you're not allowed to use your smartphone. The factory obviously has Wi-Fi for its management staff, but workers are not allowed to use it. So we're also trying to change the mindset of management to say, how do you use a tool which everyone is going to have to your benefit? How do you engage your workers? How do you get them to want to understand that you care about their welfare? And so, I mean, we really believe that actually smartphones it's like a gateway to education. And at the same time, smartphone can actually connect people, like as you all know, from Facebook and so on, which on the one hand is actually very empowering for people because they realize they're not alone. The converse is actually that it makes it a lot easier to organize workers, which it's a risk for factories because workers now might go on strike. So we have to actually do more to have a productive social dialogue with workers in an industrial circumstance. So it's actually pushing management and buyers to actually be better, okay? And whatever you think about unions, and they're self-interested and they're about money and so on, not all unions are like that, but I think the presence of tools to help workers organize is actually driving a very good change in management. It's a change in mindset on the ways that they deal with workers. And then the last one, I think smartphone and different technologies like blockchain can actually drive transparency, which is so important for workers to be protected and to know their rights. As they cross borders, we are involved in a pilot of using blockchain technology to protect human rights of workers who go from like Pakistan to Malaysia to work, or Nepal to Thailand in search of work. And these contract workers are among the most abused people because their agent in their home country tells them one thing, then they get passed on to an agent in an intermediate country or in their destination country who probably takes their money, takes their passport, and then they get passed on to a factory which may not actually pay them. So we think that actually new technologies like blockchain can actually help workers keep control of their identity and keep control over their path. As well as informing them of the dangers along the way. So those are just a few examples. I mean, I could talk a lot more about the business benefits from adopting new technology in terms of driving efficiency, becoming data-driven, becoming more efficient, becoming more sustainable. New technologies can actually be used for energy efficiency and for making factories a lot safer as well, and we're doing that as well. But I guess the one barrier I see is, again, going back to Jeanne's point about finance, is that today Asian banks, they're not really interested in financing small and medium-sized enterprises who are working at the very lowest points on the supply chain. And I think this is one issue that is a very serious one for Asia, because if factories and small and medium-sized enterprises, who, by the way, create 90% of the jobs in Asia, if they can't find financing to upgrade and improve their life and move up the value chain, then our region will go nowhere. So I think, it's up to us. We have the chance to create a new industrial paradigm where we actually bring along those workers who have actually helped build the region. But we need lots of money, lots of policy, and lots of engagement in order to do so. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is David Chua from Malaysia, and I would like to address this question very simply to the third speaker and the fourth speaker. You mentioned about empowerment of the lower income, and I refer in particular B40, the lowest 40%. Now, empowerment, I think in most developing economies, you're talking about people who are self-employed, and therefore the issue of accessibility to resources like capital is very important, and apart from the other issues. So my question is, how do you, in different economies or situations, you empower this group of people, particularly in making available financing for self-employment or starting off with micro enterprises and things like that?
Actually, I think that the next transformation that we're looking at in terms of the economic transformation that will empower the bottom, I would even say 60%, to be very honest, is actually a social transformation. And let me explain. I think that we need to think of how to build the foundation of social security as well as social inclusion in a much larger way, in a way that makes it smart economics as well. And I say this because I think in my CV, it says that I took over the Regional Commission for Asia Pacific at the time of the financial crisis of 2008. And at that time, we knew that Asia could not recover just by exporting to the G3 countries, because we cannot trade ourselves out of that crisis. We can finance ourselves out of that crisis, but not trade ourselves out. But at the same time, it was an opportunity to rethink the whole development paradigm of the region that took into account the bottom billion, if you like. And because if we have unmet needs from that our bottom billion, it means that there is also unmet needs and therefore a new market that will create demand. So how do we increase the aggregate demand from our domestic markets as well as from our regional market, from our regional arrangements? And the only way to do that is actually to increase income security and social security. And that is the only way in which we can actually deal with the whole crisis of moving up that 40%. So it became an economic interest to actually empower, and so I was able to have conversation about social protection systems as part of an economic strategy, and that in fact social security actually drives economic growth. So it was a new way of thinking. It was not a cost, but it was an investment. In the same way as you invest in infrastructure and so on. So it was investing in your social infrastructure. But equally, although we talked about closing our development gaps as a major strategy, we also talked about how to close the infrastructure gap in such a way that we don't only think of the main roads, but we also think very much of the remote roads, of the rural roads, so that farmers could bring their goods to the market. There are ways of building our infrastructure so that it is more inclusive. So there are all kinds of ways of handling that. But also, at the end of the day, I think the whole financial investment, and this can't be just microfinance. I think many of our small and medium-sized enterprises is actually beyond the whole microfinance. They need larger capital. And what I've seen is that if you look at the small and medium-sized enterprises, most of them are in the informal sector. They're not even registered. And in ASEAN, I was shocked at the number of women, small and medium-sized enterprises that are not at all registered. And therefore, they couldn't even get capital. And therefore, how do we ensure that we provide financial accessibility in new ways? And of course, I think there are all kinds of technologies which actually allow financial inclusion on a much larger scale than just the micro finance that we know of using our Grameen Bank experiences. So all that is absolutely critical. But finally, I think we cannot forget the climate change issue, because as I mentioned, Asia is so disaster prone, and the people who are most affected and find difficulty in recovering their livelihoods and so on are the very poor along much of the coastal areas and the low-lying areas. And therefore, I think we need to actually see the climate change agenda and the accountability for that as a way of securing the Asian prosperity in the next phase of kind of development. And finally, my final point is that, women's work, especially in the care sector, is totally invisible or undervalued. And it is time for us to actually invest in the care economy. And in fact, the care economy may be what will actually survive and grow in the context of the IT disruption, of the technological kind of disruption. And many of our countries are facing not just a young population, but also an aging population. And therefore, how do we care for our aging population in a way that is dignified and so on? And I just feel that the care economy has got to be not only put onto our economic agenda, but it is an essential part of the Asian future.
It goes back to the risk issue. A lot of the banks, when it's a new technology, so when our company went into renewable energy very early on, and not many knew about it as much, banks were very hesitant to loan because they didn't know much about the new technologies. And I think just speaking to that a little bit is what's interesting then, it breeds this, only those who have a good credit rating, a strong balance sheet. So these are people who already have money. And yeah, okay, you can get more lending. Whereas those that don't have any of it will never get access to it. So this is where I would like to plead for the finance industry to be a bit more innovative. Maybe even just start up a little line which, just says, look, okay, we're willing to take a little bit more risk. And the weirdest thing is sometimes it is these people who actually pay on time. Like, they don't know any better. And it's, if anything, that risk is less than what they think.
In terms of the sort of spectrum of impact investments, I think, we've seen, for example, the growth of venture philanthropy all the way to sustainable ESG enhanced investments. And, more and more research is showing that investing in ESG, motivated businesses is not just, a social motivation. It actually makes total sense economically. And sustainable businesses are the ones that will make better profit in the long run. So I think it's also a plea to the finance industry to be more long-termist, I guess, in their views of where returns are coming from. And I know that various of impact funds from the States and Europe are very interested in the Asian market, looking for good deals in the Asian market because they can see the scale and size and potential growth. But I think within Asia, we also need to adopt a long-termist view.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. I'll just go straight to the point to save time for us. For that kind of inclusive equality-prone development to happen, that cannot be divorced from policy making and government support. And there was this observation from one of the leading historians of China that even today, the economic mode in China, although everyone's commenting how much it has evolved into the kind of free market mode, but it still bears the legacy of tributum from imperial China that is not free economy, but still very much heavily influenced by decision of the central government. And talking about inequality in Hong Kong as one of the most kind of global issues, global economic city, but inequality still persists in Hong Kong. Because Diane talked about maternity and childcare in Asia that she's been involved in. Just recently, a few days ago, there was a case of a child died within 3 hours because of the lack of staff, an understaffed hospital, in a public hospital in Hong Kong, Prince Wales Hospital. So I was wondering, in your work, in terms of development, in terms of social enterprises, technology-driven development, have you come across this kind of those issues related to political power and economics, or political power or government and a market? How do you deal with it? And especially because in the case of Hong Kong, there's kind of increasing influence, not just in the past, struggling to deal with the influence from global capitalism, but today from the influence from China, be it the political market as well. And most of the issues in terms of development that we're seeing in Asia, in Hong Kong, actually are structural, political, not just development itself. So yeah.
Governments in developing countries don't always manage to cover all the bases that they necessarily should, whether you're speaking about finance, protections, rights, and so on. And the thing about private sector is that we can't wait for government to do what government should do, and it's not their fault that they can't sometimes. But we have to put in the systems to protect those who don't have protection and to make it work in a market sense. Given that markets are actually shaped by policies, which are again shaped by governments, and so it's not that we don't advocate for change, but we have to actually deal with the reality on the ground. And I'll give you one example, which is wages. So in Asia, I think the minimum wage in most of at least the ASEAN countries, and at least in Indochina, it's anywhere from 20 to 50% below a living wage. Okay, so even if you're getting paid a minimum wage in a formal job, in a good factory, you're still not making really enough to live. So is it the role of foreigners to come in and say, well, you have to raise the minimum wage and so on and so forth? Actually, minimum wage is a national dialogue between workers and their representatives and the government and factory managers in our case. And so there's no real role for foreign buyers to go and participate. And but at the same time, we know that actually the workers are not making enough money. So what can we do? Okay, so what we actually do is two things. One is to increase the education of workers about what to do with their money. Because ultimately, wage is just a number. It's actually what kind of power does that give you with that number. And if we can educate them to spend more wisely, to invest more wisely, to save, then actually they will have more purchasing power. Okay, and in some cases, it's as basic as when you receive your salary, don't give it to your husband, okay? because he may gamble it away, okay? And the thing is, you would be surprised that you have to empower people to know what they can do. And I'm not trying to be, patronizing here. This is real case. So we do a lot of financial literacy education in our factories. And the second thing is many factories actually pay their workers in cash. You can imagine all the different things that can happen when workers get paid in cash, okay? In that people take some, and then the example about don't give your salary to your husband, that comes about. So we are actually now moving to require factories to digitize their wages. And actually this is an international movement that even Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is participating in, because we find that actually if you digitize wages, and digitized wages is just about bank transfer. It's not some kind of digital economy thing. It's just very simple, in that workers should be paid in their bank account. It's more transparent. There's better control in the factory. There's less corruption. So the factory saves money. It's more efficient because you don't need to hire 3 employees every month to count physical cash. And it's a lot safer in that nobody's going to be robbed when they leave the factory. So the thing is, I mean, as a foreign buyer, we're not allowed to participate in the wage discussion, and even if we don't like the national policy and the national approach, it's just not our role. But there's things you have to look for what you can do in your sphere of influence in order to deal with those situations when government maybe is not doing as much as you would like them to do.
Are you guys really the best people to talk about energy transition? Shall we be looking for other providers and really liberalize in some ways the provision of energy in a very different way? We talked about electrical vehicles. We talked about renewable energy. I mean, there are many design questions that are easily answered nowadays. If you have a modular approach, batteries, electrical vehicles, together with renewable energy, that can get you to a much, 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 much cleaner mix than I find somewhat, I don't want to use the word lazy, but I kind of find it a little bit insulting to keep hearing that in Asia we can't afford cleaner things because we have to have coal, when of course we can. We can do all sorts of things, but why are we not using our energy to find those solutions? That is really my question. Second, just very quickly on the impact investments, I think that part of the problem is, in fact, impact investment, that we need to make impact investment a much more mainstream undertaking rather than something that's separate from the mainstream. And I think there are attempts now to incorporate them into mainstream financing. And I believe unless we do so, we can't really have the kind of revolution in finance that Jeanne and others, and Pamela and others are talking about. So I would definitely agree that finance provides the key, but I also believe that we can do better. And if we're not actually giving people the option, I mean, it wasn't so, sorry, I'm going to go on, but you know what I mean. Yeah, I think we can do better. People have done better. The poor people actually are the ones who ask for better climate responses, and we're not meeting the needs by telling them that you have to choose between different things that we shouldn't be asked to be choosing from.
When you look at energy also, there's typically a trilemma when you think of energy. It does cost money, but it helps to develop economies, it helps to develop societies. Okay, it's very important. We need a healthy and sustainable society so we can continue to do business. I mean, it's very simple. Business is nothing without a healthy society. So, but however, yes, there are certain situations where there are low-hanging fruits, like energy efficiency. To me, it's all financing, and I'm like, this is such a no-brainer, and people should be doing it. Why isn't it happening? And for some reason, part of it is cultural. That okay, and maybe in Asia, if you don't have a stick which says you will not build buildings that are this inefficient, then they will do it. I don't know. Perhaps that's the situation. But then there are some where there are going to be increasingly more difficult tensions, because the low-hanging fruits tend to be quickly done, and then you have those which, okay, we're getting to a point where the tension between the economics or the social viability of it has a little bit of a challenge. I'll give an example. Even if we're going to say, let's phase out coal in the world, and everyone's like, yay, and then I have to say, I'm one of those. And it wasn't until I had a very heartfelt conversation with a colleague who is in Australia, who works in our brown coal community, and she's a second generation who's been in that community, and that community has been living off of brown coal for this long, that she brought up, well, there are social issues. If you're going to wipe out coal, you're wiping out our whole community, and we don't know what we're going to be doing next. So there are going to be issues and challenges, and I'm not saying, and we should be solving them, but it's so new, it's a learning curve. I think we're just starting off learning, and we're encountering these challenges, and what we need to do is bunker down, what is the challenge, try to find the solutions, and then try to find the financing that will help make it happen, and just go through each of these hurdles. If these problems were so easily dealt with, they're never going to be easy. All these problems will require, it's like someone once told me, it's like death by 1,000 cuts. It's like literally that problem is because it's got 1,000 problems in it, and you have to solve all of them. So it will take time. This is why I totally agree with you. It's not that we can't do it. It takes a little bit of time. And just going back to renewable energy, I mean, this is an example that most people kind of forget. 1 megawatt of coal, and we can build 1,000 megawatts in 2 years, all right, just for one power station. But 1,000 megawatt of coal is like 5,000 megawatts of wind. And today, even wind farms are only about 200 megawatts. And even then, you've got a lot of land that you need. So there's a lot of challenges that we're still trying to learn, and we don't even have enough people who are in that industry, probably, to work in it. And this brings up just one last point that I did want to make about jobs, is we've created jobs, but are they quality jobs? Are they jobs that you want your children and your grandchildren to be in? Okay, this is the question. I said, yeah, okay, we keep talking about jobs, but are they ones that really are self-sustaining and we believe respectable?
If I can just add one thing to what Jeanne said, I think we need to recognize the scale of the mindset change we need, because basically Asia's created all these 600 million jobs by being someone else's supply chain. Okay, that means that when we go and talk to factories, they say, if my buyer wants me to do it, I'll do it. If my buyer doesn't want me to do it, I won't. And this is about energy efficiency, where the payback period is 6 months. Okay, and so, we've created this culture of, I'm your servant. If you want me to jump off the cliff, I will. But, am I going to determine who I want to be for the future? That's the attitude we need. If we're going to move from low to middle and break through the middle income trap, we need to be masters of, we need to decide who are we going to be for the world. What is going to be our capability, and then how do we invest in building that? That's the paradigm shift. And I think, it would help us address so many of these problems if we could only get out of this kind of servile mindset where we actually don't think about what is in our own best interests, and we start investing basically in ourselves.
Yeah, and maybe just to address the point on impact investment quickly. At the moment, we're nearing $300 billion US in assets under management in terms of impact investment. So that's still a drop in the ocean in terms of what the financing gap is. So I couldn't agree with you more that impact investment should be mainstreamed, and actually all investments should be impact investments, in the hopefully near future. But I think there are one or two signs that it is becoming more mainstream. I think you have seen that Larry Fink from BlackRock wrote his annual letter to the CEOs of the companies that his clients invest in, and it's really a warning shot to say, hey guys, you need to start thinking about how your company contributes to your communities, and profit motivation is not enough anymore. And I think if BlackRock can come out and say that, I think we're seeing signs that mainstream finance is going towards that direction. And, only recently, I know that Hong Kong has mandated that companies also report on ESG standards, and I know it's early stage, but I think as governments, businesses work together to make this thing a mainstream phenomenon, then I think we might get close to where we need to get to.
Hello, my name is Barbara Maynard. I'd just like to pick up the point on jobs, because I think, Noeleen, you said that the growth in Asia has been jobs-led growth, and you're talking about jobs and the mindset. The question I like to address to all the panel members is, looking ahead 3 to 5 years, when we have all been discussing, not just us here, but the world, about automation, and us being replaced by robots and then other forms of automation. The model that we had, which is intensive employment in factories at the garments level up to electronics and so forth, that has sustained Asia. Will that continue in the 3 to 5 years outlook, given the lowering cost and the greater sophistication of automation?
Asia has grown because it was factory Asia. And what does it mean to be factory Asia when you have areas in which, in fact, many countries where you have the right to work without the rights at work, right? And then a very good example of the consequence of that is actually what happened in Rana Plaza in Bangladesh with the collapse of the factories and the mobilization that went around that. to actually address, and this came both from the consumer market, the ethical, some of the younger people in terms of what they actually would buy, as well as the brands themselves, because they were affected. So there was a reputational risk in the way they actually handled it. So in a sense, even Factory Asia began to change, if you like. There was greater accountability because of different pressures, right? So that now you are not going to go for the lowest way in which you create kind of this job. So the women are still caught, unfortunately, in the lower echelons of the factories, but also in the informal sector, in the traffic workforce, because of the lack of living wage and so on. But I am hoping that if we can start training our people now, our workers now, people talk about lifelong learning. It's not just about the students who are in the university that should be doing the lifelong learning. I think all our workers. And if there is an investment in if we can have greater accountability of the private sector. So it's not just about the state. I think the private sector itself should be looking at that. If there's going to be this type of a transformation, working with the state, what can we do with our workers in order to train them, to train them to take advantage of some of the new jobs that are emerging? Because it is, of course, with the technological disruption, we're going to have perils, right? I mean, there's going to be a hollowing out of certain types of jobs. But there are also the promise that new jobs would be created. So can we look at what type of new jobs would be created, and how do we actually train our current workers, but also from our children, our girls, so that they're not afraid of STEM. They're not afraid of being computer engineers. The whole mindset about how we relate with technology would be extremely important. And I think that there are ways in which we can actually prepare our population. And the idea is to actually move from a quantity of growth to a quality of growth. And the quality of growth, obviously, for me, means quality in the way we deal with our environment, but also the way in which we deal with our social systems, in a way that we provide better quality jobs for our people. And I see that there is a possibility of doing that. But then also, what do we do? What do we do with the people who will be displaced? And I think we need to really think through our protection systems. It requires a huge mindset change, even in terms of policy. I mean, how do we make sure that if some of our middle-aged workers are suddenly displaced, they are tied to their mortgage. They have responsibilities. How do we actually ensure that there is a care system that is able to take care of that? These are, in fact, the reasons why there's so much insecurity in many of our population. And it's not just the population who are affected because of the energy, but it's also because of people who actually see that it is very difficult to navigate a future where they can actually be ensured of a more secure life.
Okay, maybe if I can share some experiences from on the ground. I don't think there's any dispute that in 15 years or 10 years or maybe even 8 years that there's going to be automated modular production lines churning out garments and consumer products without any human supervision. Maybe there will be one human. Just like warehouses and all kinds of, even factory automation has taken place. Okay. So it's already happening. Now the question is, what is going to be our journey from now until there? Okay, are we going to do it by shutting down the factory and laying off the people, or by bringing them along and doing a very gradual step towards robotics? Actually, robotics is the final step. in digitization. It begins with simple process digitization and getting more data from processes, even while they may be labor intensive, and then connectivity, IoT, then automation, and then, it's actually a whole progression of steps, and that's the only way that you can actually bring the workers along. And we have actually done research in one of our own factories on what is the experience of workers undergoing digitization and the creation of IoT networks in the factory in order to drive efficiency and provide more transparency. And the outcomes show that workers are not insecure about the prospect that they may be disintermediated by technology. They are insecure because they are afraid the factory is not moving fast enough, because they see the changes around them and they want the factory to move faster. They're also insecure because they don't have transparency from their own management about what's coming next, because in Asian factories, it's very top down and the worker is the last person to find out. So it requires us to actually change the culture of how we actually manage people in order that they can actually be confident, learn new skills, be empowered. In this factory, actually, most of the employees there have been there 15 and 20 years, so they are not digital natives. But we have trained them and upskilled them so that they can be functional in a digital economy. And we have no doubt there will be workers who leave, but it's our responsibility and it's in our self-interest to make sure that when they leave the factory, they are doing so with skills that will enable them to be productive in the digital economy. And I think we're actually very fortunate that the education system in Asia is slightly inadequate when it comes to digital literacy, that we can only proceed at a very measured pace with regard to automation. And we're also lucky that automation for textiles is actually not really there yet. Okay, so we actually have time to prepare. Now, are we going to be smart and put the right policies in place and start reforming our education system now? Or are we just going to wait till we get hit with a tidal wave? And I think this is a question that all of us should be asking our governments, because we need governments to be more long-term and to not be afraid of making decisions which will upset education officials and industry officials and so on. We need courageous governments. And from industry perspective, I think we are all supportive of putting more technology in and moving towards that automated future, because that's the only future there is. That's what technology enables us to do.
Just a comment and then a question. It seems to be a big theme, is a financing gap theme as it relates to everything you're all talking about, which I fully agree, and I think there's a long way to go. I come from the financing world at HSBC, so I just wanted to comment. There's been tremendous development, and you may not be aware of it unless you live it, in the past 5 years in supply chain finance and in sustainable finance. Tremendous consistency in structures now, where you take the big buyer risk and finance the smaller buyers. You don't have to take the smaller buyer risk. So there's been structure legally and regulatory that has been blessed. So it's a huge market development in the past 5 years. We're big into it. A lot of the big banks are, as well as local banks. Number two is fintech development. So we all hear about fintech, but there's also been a huge amount of fintech investment is in this space of supply chain. So I also wanted to just let everybody know that. So in terms of digitizing the supply chain finance, there's been tremendous investment and focus in the last 5 years as well. So just wanted to share that. And then as HSBC, this is all public, we committed $100 billion for sustainable finance. But we need more ideas, and that's where I'm going to get to my question. We just passed our 1-year milestone, and we spent $25 billion as it relates to renewable energy, electric vehicles, and supply chain. But it's never enough. And my question is this. So given all the developments, and please, if you want to learn more about it, I'm happy to share offline. The question is, these forums are great, we talk about the issues, but I really think we need call to action. And how do we collaborate and not just walk away, oh, that was a great event. So my question is this, given our commitment as an institution to the industries and to many sectors, including retail, apparel, every sector you spoke about, what more can we do? Because we actually need more ideas, right? And it can't just come from bankers. And we want to use the $100 billion. We want to blow through it and do more. But I think collaboration is key because there's a lot of forums like this you attend on sustainability. People talk and talk and talk. But I think without the call to action and without a commitment out of those events, it just kind of goes nowhere. You know, it's like research papers that go nowhere. So as you know, new Bloomberg Economy Forum was last week, and you know, we were a very active participant, and we led the Sustainable Supply Chain workshop. And we got commitments from big corporates to do something about it. So now there's a whole work stream that's come out of that. So question is, what more can we do? Do you have any ideas? And you know, let's kind of get to call to action. What do we do about everything you talked about? I'd love to hear. Thank you.
I think in terms of, I've heard a lot about sort of investors actually having the money here in Asia, but that there are not enough sort of good opportunities or deals, even though there's a lot that has already been done. And I think as Jeanne mentioned, I think the policy and legal context is pretty important here. In the UK, for example, we have a social investment tax relief. There's obviously also the B Corp movement coming out of the States and now going global in terms of making it very clear as to which companies have the highest standards for social and environmental impact. So I think some sort of accreditation and signal to the investors that they are putting money into high impact companies will help move the investment market along a little bit more. I think secondly, I think the ecosystem around the impact investment market I see in Asia is still at quite an initial stage of development when I compare it to the States and Europe. You know, when I talk about an ecosystem, I mean all the way from incubators of enterprises to, you know, intermediaries that put the deals together, to people who actually are specialized at measuring impact. And I think without the piece around impact measurement and really showing how sustainable finance funds are actually generating positive impact, I don't think we have the evidence base to necessarily pull more money into this area. So I think the accountability matters, and I think the capacity building of the whole sector would help drive more deal flow in this area in Asia.
So I agree. I think it's about the soft skills now, the knowledge, the professionals that are needed. Even when you say green financing, well, who's checking that the carbon reduction is really happening? Who's verifying that? When we say we've reduced air emissions, well, who's actually counting and who actually has the credentials to verify that? So I think professional training and even professionalizing, and so this is a little bit of my pet project where I feel professionalizing those who are working in the environmental industry. Just like you have chartered engineers, you have chartered accountants. Why, if environment is so important, it is not recognized as a profession? Why do people who practice in this important area, why are they not recognized? And if funding could be provided more in that direction, which basically boosts the capability and capacity in terms of professional knowledge and training, financial literacy, digital literacy, all of those things that Pamela had mentioned, all those areas, knowledge, basically knowledge and capacity building, I think I totally agree is probably very, very key.
I would actually stress on the sustainable development goals and the agenda, the 2030 agenda on sustainable development to transform our world, and the whole premise is to leave no one behind. So I'm going to talk about how do we deal with changing the trajectory of the most vulnerable people in our societies, and most of them are actually invisible in our discussion. I've not heard them being mentioned at all so far throughout the whole day. And okay, we talked about the small and medium-sized enterprises of women, the women in the informal sector. We have touched that. But who have we left behind? We have actually left behind, actually today, in today's world, as we are growing in terms of our wealth and so on, we have 68.5 million displaced people, internally and externally, some moving as refugees and others just literally displaced because of conflicts, because of tensions, because of natural disasters, and so on. And I work with many of these people in the communities, and they struggle to just get the basic livelihood not even the minimum wage, anything, and they have nothing. And how do we ensure? I know it's going to be very difficult for institutions to directly fund them and so on. But can we think through this in a little more innovative way, in such a way that perhaps when we are funding our supply chain and so on, we can actually see how can we employ some of these people. In fact, some of the governments, like in Malaysia, they have provided temporary work permits for some of these people, but at the same time, it's very difficult for them to get employment. So is there incentive through our funding system so that we can actually ensure that the people who are being left behind actually have an opportunity to get employment in a way that can sustain their livelihoods rather than fall into the criminal economy, if you like? Because if we don't fund them and provide them with a future, other people will. And this has been an issue that has been troubling me for a very long time. I haven't sought out how best to get the financial sector, because whenever we talk about finance, it's always about, those whom we can reach. But if we are very serious about leaving no one behind, let's look at who are we leaving behind.
I'm sure we can all ask more questions during cocktail time and later on. So that's all for today. Thank you very much, everyone.
And can I add thank you, Bruna, for moderating?
You're welcome.